Hey everybody, thanks for joining me here on the Greenery YouTube channel. We are getting ready to release our Spring 2024 collection called Spring Fling, and one of the new products in that collection is a new print shop set. It's called Print Shop Modern Botanical, and it's a great stamp and stencil combo that creates this pretty floral pattern to pretty much fill an A2 card front. So let's take a look at the set. The stamp and stencil come together. There's a 4x6" stamp set that includes some foliage details as well as some details for some of the larger flowers. And then there is a 4-piece stencil set. There are 4 different steps for the leaves and some of the various flowers and flower centers. So like I said, the stamps and stencils come together. There's also a die available separately. This die cuts out many of the blooms from the stencil set. So let's go ahead and stencil and stamp this set so you can see it in action. I have a mix of Distress Oxide inks here that I'll be using to do the stenciling and stamping. I have evergreen bough, crackling campfire, saltwater taffy, picked raspberry, spun sugar, fossilized amber, and then a tailored expressions spearmint, which is what I'm going to be using to stamp the foliage. So we're going to start with step 1 of the stencils, and I have an A2 panel of cardstock already cut. This is a super pale green cardstock. The color is called Grigio. It's from Cardstock Warehouse. So I'm just going to start with stencil number 1. Each stencil is engraved with a number in the upper left corner, so you know that you have the right orientation of your stencil, you know they're positioned right, so everything will line up. So there's also a guide included with the set, and it shows you what it looks like when it's all assembled. So I'm just starting with stencil number 1, and I'm using my evergreen bough ink and just a small finger brush, and I'm going to just stencil over this step 1. So we can remove the stencil, and stencil number 1 is finished. The next step is to stamp the foliage details. So to do the stamping, I'm going to pull out my MISTI, and I'm going to make sure that I'm paying attention to the top part. What is the top of the design? The foliage details come in 2 stamps. They're labeled upper right and lower left. And so this upper right cluster coordinates with this leaf cluster here, and the lower left corner goes in this area. So I want to make sure that I'm kind of paying attention to what is the top of my panel. If you need to mark that in order to remember it, you can always do that with just a little pencil mark or something, but I'm just going to put it in my MISTI so that I know that that's the top. So we're going to put these in our MISTI, this upper right. I'll go ahead and put that in my MISTI, and you'll be able to see where it lines up. These leaves overlap the stenciled leaves and add some detail to those. It's pretty simple to line up. It goes just like that, and I'm going to close my lid. And then I'm going to move my panel down to the bottom corner, and I'm going to line up the other leaf detail. You won't be able to stamp them at the same time, but I'm going to put them in my MISTI at the same time so I can stamp the top, move my panel down, and stamp the bottom. All right, so I'm going to move my panel back to the top. I have some spearmint ink from Tailored Expressions that I'm going to use to stamp both of those over top of my stenciled evergreen bough leaves. I'm going to shift my panel down to the bottom and stamp the second step. With our leaf details stamped, we're going to move on and finish our stenciling. I'm stenciling step 2, and I'm using a mix of picked raspberry and saltwater taffy inks for this step. I like to use these smaller brushes because it lets me more easily add different colors to the different areas of the stencil without really having to do any masking. These are far enough apart that you can pretty easily add different colors. We're going to move on to stencil number 3, which is the little daisies up in the corners as well as a ton of little flowers. I'm going to be using fossilized amber for this step. And then for step 4, I'm using crackling campfire. This is just all of the little flower centers. And then lastly, we can stamp the details on the 3 blooms in the center. So I'm going to lay all of these stamps on top of the panel. They're not super fussy about how you line them up. I'm just kind of paying attention to see how the centers are a little bit oblong and the opening in between all the little details is also sort of oblong. And so I'm just gonna kind of line that up, and then I'm going to pick those all up with a single block and stamp them all together. And to stamp these, I'm going to be using aged mahogany. I also sometimes like to add some shading with some colored pencils, so I'm going to do that now to the flower centers. I have a colored pencil that's just slightly darker than the crackling campfire ink I used for the flower centers, and I'm just adding some shading just kind of to one side of each of those flower centers. It almost gives it a little shadow, gives them some dimension, and makes those centers and those flowers really come to life. I also like to add pen details using a white pen, and I'm just adding some dots to the flower centers. I always love the artsy feel that white splatters give my project, so I'm going to be using some white ink and adding some splatters too. To finish it off, we're going to keep it super simple. I have a Love You Mom sentiment here, which was stamped and heat embossed with gold embossing powder using our new To Mom with Love stamp set, which is also part of our new Spring Fling collection. And I'm just going to add that with some foam adhesive on the back to pop that up and give that a bit of dimension. Just keep it nice and simple so our pretty background can really shine. I have another panel here that I'm working on. I have the background already done, and I want to add some layers to this one with the coordinating die. And I wanted to show you how easy that die is to use. You can either die cut first and stencil second, or vice versa, stencil first and die cut second. It's an open die. The dies are grouped together. So for example, for these 3 blooms on this stencil step, the die is grouped together so that they are in the right position to go ahead and cut those all 3 at the same time. So I'm going to be stenciling the flowers from steps 2 and 3 onto a panel of cardstock. I'll also go ahead at the same time and stencil all of the flower centers using step 4 stencil. And while those are all in one piece, I'll also go ahead and stamp the flower details on those 3 blooms in the center. Then I can go ahead and position my dies over the top of my stenciled images and run them through my die cut machine. The daisy clusters in the corner are similar, but not exactly the same. So you're going to want to make sure you get the correct die laid over top of each one. You should be able to see that from how they are laid out, but just take note of that they are similar, but slightly different. I'll go ahead and die cut these and be right back. So there you can see we have all of these little die cut blooms that we can then use to layer over our stencil design to create more dimension and a fuller floral design. So I played around with the design until I found a position that I liked for my extra blooms, and then I adhered those in place. The ones in the center I attached just with liquid adhesive, and then the ones around the more outer edges I used foam tape for a little dimension. That way I could add a die cut sentiment to the center without worrying about popped up flowers in the middle interfering with that. So this sentiment is from our new Simply Bold Love die. To make sure I'm getting my sentiment adhered nice and straight, I'm using our Alpha Alignment Guide, which is just a handy little tool that we have in the shop. It's made out of stencil material, and it has openings on the top and bottom for a horizontal or vertical A2 card. And so I have that laying across my card, taped in place, and lined up with my grid mat so that I can get those letters nice and straight. And there our card is finished, and it would be perfect for our gorgeous wedding card. Thanks so much for joining me for this look at our new print shop Modern Botanical set. This set will be available from thegreetery.com beginning at 10 a.m. Eastern Time on Thursday, February 29.